So, as Brian said, this is the first of a series of talks looking at the benefits of mitigation. I'm going to present some excerpts from a broader study we did, the American Climate Prospectus. And you can see on here our list of co-authors on the Climate Prospectus research team. In the talks we've given, you've missed all of them except that last one, so if you want to see more tomorrow, Amir's presenting one. There's also a 200-page report at climatesprospectus.org and a book that's coming out from Columbia University Press in the spring. So the American Climate Prospectus was the independent technical analysis that served as the input to the Risky Business Project, which is a project led by these three gentlemen here, Mayor Bloomberg, Tom Steyer, and Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. And their charge to our research team is what's down here. So our goal, first of all, was to provide a risk-based assessment of climate change impacts in the U.S. So we're going to be talking a lot about probabilities and assessments of uncertainties. And there's a couple of conditionalities that may matter when we compare to some of these other studies you'll hear about. So first of all, they wanted us to conduct a study under a stationary socioeconomic structure. So some of the other talks probably today will probably be looking at impacts under different socioeconomic pathways. Mayor Bloomberg didn't want to go out and talk to his peers about the shape of the economy in 2080. He wanted to talk about the risk caused by climate change. And so rather than getting into an argument about the shape of the economy in 2080, it's kind of easier to communicate, the risks that the people making decisions, the business leaders and policymakers have to adapt to if we kept everything the same. And secondly, a key sort of technical characteristic of what we did, this is grounded in observational data about the relationship between climate variability and economic variables. And I'll talk about that more as we go along. So our overall research framework is something that after many long weeks talking about acronyms, we called CGLASS, the Spatial Empirical Adaptive to Global to Local Assessment System. In the general framework, shown here. So we start with downscaled probabilistic physical climate projections. I'll give you a brief overview of those in a bit. And then we take these projections of variables like temperature and precipitation and sea level rise and feed them into impact models. Most of our impact models are based on a meta-analysis of econometric research. Econometrics is, for those of you who don't know, is just what economists call statistics. And so I'll talk about those. And then in a couple of sectors, we used detailed sectoral models, particularly in the energy sector and coastal impact sectors, that model the physical processes involved. And then in this talk, I won't have time to talk about it, but we take these different impacts we modeled and integrate them in sort of a comprehensive model of the national economy, a computable general equilibrium model. So first on the physical projections, so as I said, we're focused on characterizing uncertainty, so we wanted to come up with things in a sort of self-consistent probability distribution. Now, to be clear, this is a problem of deep uncertainty. There is no single probability distribution, but a reasonable probability distribution is a good starting point for risk analysis. So for our temperature and precipitation projections, we started with a probability distribution for global temperature change under different socioeconomic scenarios. And to get that projection of global temperature change, we did what many people do, which is use a probabilistic simple climate model. MAGIC is the one we used in the case you're familiar with it. And so the simple climate model gives us this probability distribution shown in the blue curve. This is just looking at the average over a 20-year time interval, but the entire pathway of global mean temperature. And so you can see this PDF of global temperature projections in 2080 to 2099. But nobody lives at the global mean, so you need to translate those global projections into regional projections. And so to do that, we turn to the community modeling efforts represented by CMIP5. We used the global temperature projections as a way of placing Bayesian weights on the different models in the archive, and then because the tails, as Klaus was talking about, are important, we sort of filled in the tails using pattern scaling. So you can see here some of the different maps of US temperature anomalies that are consistent with different parts of the global temperature distribution. We also considered sea level, and we came up with a framework for probabilistic localized sea level rise projections, taking into account the different factors that cause sea level rise, say, in Louisiana, to differ from sea level rise in Seattle. And these were published in Earth's Future, and I talked about these a couple days ago, so I'm not going to say anything more about them. And it's also important when you think about risk to realize people are not only not living at the global mean, they're also not living at the 20-year mean. They're living day to day. They're experiencing weather, not climate. And so you need to take into account climate variability. A lot of the impacts are felt because of the interaction between the changes in the mean and the changes with climate variability. This figure is just to illustrate that. This is one particular run at one particular location of one particular model under one scenario. So this is a GFDL model running RCP 8.5, a high emissions RCP at New York City. This is summer average temperature, and I just like this one because note from about 2020 to 2040 or so, you see declining summer average temperatures in New York City under RCP 8.5 in this one particular run, right? That points to the importance, particularly at a regional scale, of sort of decadal scale variability. So that's the physical background. As I said, for most of our impact sectors, we turned to what I'll just call the statistical literature, and we did this using a tool we developed called the distributed meta-analysis system. So the idea here is that there's been a bunch of work in the econometric community over the last decade or so, where people have gone and looked at the relationship between climate variability and economic parameters, and have generated what we are called dose-response functions, perfectly analogous to dose-response functions in the biostatistic literature, right? So you have a certain amount of temperature or precipitation, and you get a certain amount of response in something like mortality or labor productivity or something like that. So we wanted to build a platform where we could do meta-analyses and where the community could contribute to it, so we didn't have to always maintain it. We could update it with new results easily as this became available. So this is the platform my colleague James Rising and Hsiang developed, and this is showing you a meta-analysis of, I think that's mortality, or violent crime versus temperature. Saul actually talked about that in the previous part of the session. So the impact sectors we assessed, first of all, this is not a comprehensive list of all the impacts of climate change. We, first of all, only had 9 months to do this analysis, and secondly, there's no way of doing a comprehensive economic analysis, so we focused on ones where there was some way of making some quantitative headway. So the statistical approach we applied in 4 sectors. So agriculture, we looked at the major commodity crops in the U.S., taking into account the effects of CO2 fertilization and crop storage, and the fact that you have different temperature responses if you have irrigated versus non-irrigated crops. We looked at the effect of temperature on labor productivity, so particularly in sectors where people work outside, like construction or mining or agriculture, and in the manufacturing sector, there's a strong relationship between the number of hours people work and the temperature, so that causes a decline in labor productivity. There's also a relationship in the quality of the work people provide with temperature that we didn't include. We have heat and cold related mortality by age group, and we have property and violent crime, which again Salt talked about earlier in the session. As I mentioned, there are a couple of sectors where we used models that model the whole process. So energy demand and energy price, we modeled using a version of the Energy Information Administration's National Energy Modeling System. In coastal inundations and storms, we partnered with Risk Management Solutions, a leading provider of risk analysis to insurance companies, and used their storm model, which models about 30,000 stochastic storms and looks at flood and wind and business interruption damages. So for those 4 econometric sectors, these are showing you the distributions of impacts in the median case for late in the century. So you can see some impacts, like agriculture, are pretty heterogeneous across the U.S. This is not taking into account changes in the availability of water resources for irrigation, so that could change the picture significantly in the western half of the country. This is labor productivity impacts, so negative almost everywhere. Violent crimes, negative almost everywhere. And then mortality rates, we see a significant decrease, particularly in the southeastern U.S., but an increase in some of the increase in deaths, increase in mortality in the southeastern, a decrease in deaths in some of the northern tier states because of reduced cold stress. So here comes the mitigation part. So this is looking at the national impacts under different representative concentration pathways, which most of you are probably familiar with the RCPs, but if you're not, 8.5 is sort of a high-end business as usual, 4.5 is sort of a moderate emissions reductions, and 2.6 is strong emissions reductions. That's the one that's most consistent with the international 2-degree target. So you'll notice that the benefits of mitigation in the U.S. fall into a number of different patterns. So for some impact sectors, there's a more or less monotonic relationship between mitigations and benefits. So in sectors like labor productivity, both the full range and the median decline as you decrease emissions. Similarly, violent crime. Similarly, energy expenditures. If you look at mortality, you see a somewhat more complicated story. You get a big reduction in mortality as you go from no emissions reductions to moderate emissions reductions. But because you have these effects operating in opposite directions, you see a reduction in cold deaths and an increase in heat deaths. There's not much change as you go from RCP 4.5 to 2.6, but some reduction in the tail risk. Crop yields, you see a more or less monotonic decline in the median projection, but because you have this highly uncertain contribution from CO2 fertilization, you've got a significant ambiguity the whole way. So basically, mitigation in agriculture is buying you a reduction in uncertainty. And then in coastal damages, which are slightly cut off on the screen, you can see you get this sort of monotonic decrease, but it's of order about 30%. The sea level rise is slowly responding to changes in forcing, and so in the 21st century you see some benefits from mitigation, but the largest benefits from mitigations in terms of sea level and coastal impacts really sort of start to come in towards the end of the century and then the next century. Here's another way of thinking about it. Remember I talked about the importance of variability, right? So we can think of, say, a 1 in 20-year event right now. So a 1 in 20-year heat wave would be sort of a heat wave with about a 5% probability in a typical year. Here we're looking at essentially a current 1 in 20-year heat wave in terms of national number of deaths. And we're looking at the number of those events you expect over a 20-year period over time. So taking into account both the variability around the mean and the uncertainty in the projections. So for mortality, RCP 2.6, you don't see much change in the number of expected 1 in 20-year heat waves. Under RCP 4.5, by late century, you expect the current 1 in 20-year heat wave in terms of mortality about not 5% of the time, but 10% of the time. And in RCP 8.5, you really see the skyrocketing frequency, expected number of 1 in 20-year events, so that by late century, the 1 in 20-year heat wave has sort of become a 50% probability heat wave. This gets slightly different patterns in different impact sectors. So this is agriculture, so you see some increase in RCP 2.6 with the number of crop loss events, the current 1 in 20-year event becoming a 1 in 5-year event, and then sort of continued increase in 4.5 and 8.5. And labor productivity is even a more extreme signal. So under RCP 2.6, sort of the 1 in 20-year labor loss from heat waves becomes sort of a 1 in 2-year event. And in RCP 8.5, by late century, you start seeing things outside of the realm of past experience, the sort of heat-induced reductions in labor productivity. We can monetize these in various ways I can't talk about to look at their comparative importance to the economy. So in sort of market terms, the labor productivity loss is actually the most important one. But if you use, say, a value of a statistical life to look at the costs of those mortality increases, this by far dominates your costs. So that's valuing things at $7 billion. This purple line for comparison is if you only value people's lives at sort of their lost income, which is not a very good way of valuing people's lives. But if you add these together, these 6 impact categories add up to about 0.5 to 5% of U.S. GDP of a 90% probability range if you don't use the value of a statistical life and you assume no changes in the frequency of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. If you allow for stronger hurricanes, you get a slight increase, but the big increase, if you use a value for statistical life, is to get that range from about 0.5 to 9.5% of GDP. So we've got a number of innovations that can be applied more widely. I'm getting a blinking red light, so I'll just flash those on. And we're moving forward to sort of extend this work to a global scale and taking into account some of the things you'll probably hear about in the later talks about socioeconomic scenarios. And our book is coming out in the spring. So thanks.